in process terms. The challenge is attitude. I can't speak for the Abbott government, but it is a more difficult issue, more problematic issue when you look at the wider issue of use and possession as opposed to medicinal cannabis. Seems to me, even when I put my 33-year operational police hat on, that the case for medicinal cannabis is sort of overwhelming, irresistible, uncontestable. And it was terrific. Terrific to see the Premier, hear what the Premier said yesterday morning. I think that was a very strong statement of support, that he was going to launch action. That would happen and would happen quickly. And I think the making exception and allowing the access to people in Dan's position and many others, and we just heard 3 very sad cases in the last half an hour, can happen and should happen, very, very quickly.
Has this always been your view?
It's been my view for a long time. I really, and quite frankly, I hadn't had occasion to look carefully at medicinal cannabis until reasonably recently, not long before Lucy Haslam's case became public. I'd thought more broadly about the use of the criminality or the criminal approach to use and possession of drugs. My experience had told me more and more convincingly as I went through it that our policy was wrong. Law enforcement with its best efforts, no matter that it got more effective, more efficient, more sophisticated, using better technology, etc., still made no difference. And in fact that we often through that process aggravated the harms rather than minimised them or reduced them. And that
we've seen examples of that.
And we're seeing some classic examples of that now. So I came to the view a long time ago, frankly, that even when I was still serving, that the focus of police and law enforcement ought to be on drug trafficking and the high end of the scale, and that use and possession, as Greg said, is a health issue, and we ought to deal with it as a health issue. This is absolutely the A class, the gold class health issue. I mean, if ever there's something that is uncontestable, it's the use of medicinal and access to medicinal cannabis. And I understand the comments made by Dave Alsop this morning about the clinical trial. I work with the TGA as a commissioner in the AFP. But we've just watched, but I think, and Clint would probably agree, that we lock up people for very serious crime from homicide down on the basis of beyond reasonable doubt. We don't commit or conduct clinical trials to find people guilty of very serious crimes. We really carry out what are court jurisdictional case studies, just like the 3 case studies we heard about in the last half an hour. And we find people guilty of crimes on the back of the assessment of those case studies, and often then convict them and sentence them to life imprisonment. So to suggest that the case studies we've just listened to aren't persuasive enough to allow governments to make decisions and take action, to me, is mind-boggling.
Well, since you've been public about it, what kind of reaction have you had from your peers, and has there been any reaction from the government?
Well, I haven't raised that particular issue about medicinal cannabis with the government.
But you've publicly spoken out about it,
yes,
which has been brave on your behalf.
Yeah, I don't know about brave, but I mean, sometimes you need to be able to use your experience, which gives a little bit of influence. No, it wasn't difficult for me to speak out. I felt compelled to in many cases. Some people were surprised that I changed my attitude and jumped ship, as they said. The vast majority of my colleagues understood. Very many police hold the same view. As I think Clint would verify, I mean, many people feel like we feel, like Clint has expressed in regard to Luke's case, that there is an exercise of discretion that goes with the exercise of police powers, but that's an individual discretion, and to leave that out there to be interpreted separately and differently by individual officers in situations like this is an unsatisfactory situation. The public opinion in support of medicinal cannabis, you quoted the figures yesterday, is overwhelming, very high, in the high 70s. So it's not as if there's likely to be a heavy public backlash. I think in regard to the exercise of discretion and the unfairness or the uncertainty when you leave that out for individual police to exercise or district by district for it to be exercised, and it's really an individual thing, discretion. Mike Baird's comments yesterday that he's moving to settle, obviously with the Commissioner, a set of guidelines or rules, he called them, I think, rules, governing the exercise of discretion for medicinal cannabis is a very positive thing. Obviously, they can't really be rules, they're only guidelines, discretion being an individual issue.
And that's just New South Wales?
But that's for New South Wales, but he also gave the indication, I thought, yesterday that he'd spoken to colleagues and it was likely that a similar approach would be taken around the country, and I think that's critically important, and that's obviously what Richard Di Natale is hoping will flow from his bill, which is at the other end of the equation, if you like, in terms of the licensing issue, where states can mirror Commonwealth law. If the Commonwealth law is passed, of course, each state can mirror that law, which happens in a whole range of legal areas, and so every state legislates the same, precisely same piece of legislation that the federal government has legislated, because the federal government legislation won't impact or control the state behaviour.
Is that likely to happen?
Well, I understand at the COAG meeting, the Council of Australian Governments meeting, where Premiers and Prime Ministers attend, and the Prime Minister attends, that agreement was reached in principle for that bill to be adopted by the states if it was passed.
Okay.